some projects going on over there that are looking very good. And then, yeah, there's several of this type of project that's being deployed now. So it'll be really good in the future to keep an eye on these. Oh, and then I didn't realize that was a special graphic, but there you go. So that's the temperatures for this type of geothermal. So another thing that is being heavily explored because geothermal is very expensive. So that's part of why there isn't as much development. It can last for a very long time, the power plants, but it's a very, very high upfront investment. And one way to reduce or to make it more economic is by extracting critical minerals from brines. So there's a lot of exploration and research going into extracting lithium.
Jessica, does lithium generally occur in that brine? Or is
Yes. Yep.
some places more than others?
Yep. They all have different chemical compositions, and some have more critical minerals and some have less, so it's variable.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the brine?
The salt, so salt water.
You have to pump that down.
No. So it would be produced from a formation that's like an underground aquifer that's not water that we could utilize, and it is most likely full of dissolved solids. So
So it's just something we discover when we drill for the geothermal well.
Yeah, so you would have to do a water chemistry test once on the formation, and then that would also affect the type of pipes and equipment that you would use, like your pumps, because some brines are more corrosive than others. So that also very heavily affects cost. Oh,
So one more question. So 5 megawatts, you said?
yes.
Can you translate that for like how many houses or?
I think 1 megawatt is 1,000 houses. So yeah, so 5,000 houses. Any other questions on that part? Oh, go ahead.
So does the brine, you pump it up and then does it circle back down again?
Yeah, let's see. Can I go back to that slide?
There's two kinds of ways of doing it, right? There's like an open loop system and a closed loop system.
Yeah, so there's an open loop system and a closed loop system. I think the open loop system is much further along in development. The closed loop system, they do have some projects coming up. Okay, yeah, so if you could see, there's arrows going up one side. So there's a production well and an injection well. So for all of these systems, there's production and injection. And with this type of system, they have to be closely monitored to avoid induced seismicity, because that's one of the big challenges and concerns that people have had with disposal wells from the oil and gas industry, the brines that are produced with oil and gas production are often disposed of in a formation that can accept the water or brine back into it. Okay, so this slide is on direct use. So the temperature is relatively low, and it can be used to heat and cool buildings and houses. The map on the top, that's on the top right, is of Boise, Idaho, and they have a direct use geothermal system for heating. And there's a little schematic that kind of gives you a visual. So you're pulling water from aquifer that is not as deep as what we were talking about with like the brines. So you're pulling up water, and then you're using a working fluid or fresh water to circulate through the building or community that you're wanting to heat and cool. And then the map of the United States is from NREL, and it's the favorability of direct use systems in the US. So the northern part here, since our air temperature is cooler like throughout the year, it's more beneficial here than say in Texas. We can actually utilize the resource. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, is the favorability because with the cooler air temperatures, there's a higher differential between the groundwater and the
Yes.
surface temperature?
Yeah, it definitely makes a big impact with the air temperature. And this can be used to support greenhouses and food preservation, fish farming. It has a lot of applications, as you can kind of see on that little chart on the side.
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
So, since she was talking about the brine, brine is not the only fluid which is carrier of the heat, but brine is typically the one that is used because it's already there inside of here. So, majority of the time people repurpose the oil and gas well, and since they produce so much water out of those wells, they can actually reuse those water and inject that and use that groundwater for the geothermal purposes. But still, there are like other carriers of the heat that could be used. For example, one of the things that they usually use that is like the supercritical CO2, because CO2 when it becomes like in a supercritical situation, it becomes fluid. So it can actually carry the heat inside of here. But the thing is that it costs them much more money, because they are actually injecting something that was outside of the system, and now they are going to put it to the system. So when she talked about the brine, it's just because that is just a thing that is already there, and they're trying to take advantage of the fluid carrier that they have inside of here.
So Munis, I would say, is more of an expert on geothermal. So if you guys have questions afterwards, she's a girl.
I was trying to a little bit explain that, because sometimes people are confused that why are you using the brine instead of any other fluid. We can actually use the other things, but the fact is that it's cheaper because it's already local.
Yes, and from a standpoint of like community involvement, people aren't going to be as excited about you injecting something into the earth that's not already there. With the brine, it's kind of like it's coming out of this formation, we're putting it back into that formation. Heat pumps. So this is probably what most of you are familiar with geothermal energy. And it can be connected to an HVAC system and used for heating and cooling of homes and commercial buildings. It cools them down in the summer, heats them up in the winter. The loops, the geothermal loops are buried underground, so they're either horizontal or vertical. If you're getting a new house built, it'll likely be a horizontal build. But you can add it to an existing home, in which case they will likely drill to get that resource for you. So heat pumps can make quite possibly the biggest impact on our country's energy use, especially in the northern latitudes. Because most of our energy in like North Dakota, Minnesota, like it goes to heating. And if we can use heat pumps to bring up that temperature, then we would utilize so much less energy. And then another bigger geothermal application that's coming up now is geothermal energy storage. This pairs well with other renewable resources, like wind and solar. If there's an excess that's being produced, that electricity can be turned into heat and pumped into the ground. So the two examples that I have up here, one is a borehole storage system. So they drill a bunch of holes and they pump the heat down there, and then they pull it up as heat in like a direct use application later when it's needed. And the bottom one is an aquifer storage system, and those are seeming to have better energy recovery rates, and you can utilize the energy sooner because the ground temperature has to be heated when you're pumping the excess energy in. So it takes a few years with the borehole array, and it doesn't take as long with the aquifer. Charge it up. So hurdles to geothermal development. Permitting takes a long time. I think that's kind of one of the biggest hurdles right now is just getting everything through all of the different agencies that don't like have policies exactly on geothermal. And then policy. So it's a more expensive energy resource, like at the beginning, because it costs more to put in. But it's also competing with energy sources that are supplemented by the government. So since like fossil fuels has so many like breaks, it's cheaper. It would still be cheaper, but it's even more cheaper than it would be without subsidies. Funding, you could see that little chart there. So this is kind of the development of a geothermal project. The dotted line is cost. So at the very beginning of the project, the costs aren't very high, but the risk is very high. So trying to find a favorable area, and companies are investing more money and kind of not 100% sure if it's going to pan out like at the beginning, but as you move along, you mitigate those risks. So you don't keep moving forward if it's not unfavorable, and by the end it's low risk, but then obviously then you're starting to spend more. Public awareness, like I was mentioning earlier. Geothermal power plants aren't as pretty as, say, solar. So that combined with, like, I think people kind of just need to understand geothermal more. And transmission. So that's kind of an issue with all renewable resources right now. The transmission queues are quite long, so anyone that's building a major project that wants to get it on the grid, I think the application, like if you put in an application now, they can do a study on your project like 5 years from now. And that's with the balancing authorities. And in addition to that, once your project does get funded, then the energy operator is responsible for building out the transmission lines to get their energy to a point where it can interconnect. So that's surprisingly holding up a lot of projects, because the cost is, it's like $1 million a mile for transmission, something like that. But that's preventing a lot of projects across renewable development moving forward.
Yes, so can I ask, how flexible is location for a geothermal plant? Because a lot of solar and wind has to be pretty far from population centers.
Yeah.
Well,
With geothermal.
Geothermal, what's the
So
situation?
it's somewhat flexible. Yeah, but there's issues with like land acquisition too. So it also kind of depends on like where you're able to get land. Yeah.
But in
you have-
principle, you could build something, a mile from the
So,
cities.
Yeah, so on principle, technically yes, but a lot of, so I guess the way that I think about it is my community, where we were looking into developing a project, where we're still wanting to develop a project. We are quite far from transmission, so it's a reservation, and during the time when they were building out transmission lines, reservations were actively voided because there's more rules for building across a reservation. So I do a lot of other projects in Indian energy, and that's, I guess, kind of maybe more where I see the hang up is building in those communities.
So then for that, is your idea that you want to sell it or that you want the energy to go to your community?
Both. Economic development. So CCL has been working to further geothermal awareness and policy development. These are from the last 2 years. The group met with Senator Kramer in Bismarck to talk about many things, but one of the items on the agenda was geothermal and permit reform and development, and bringing it to a wider audience, like right now. The group also came out to our community engagement event in Newtown, North Dakota, which is where I'm from, on the reservation, and that was pretty great. So community engagement. This is actually like my only slide on community engagement. It is extremely important. So why engage your community or the community? So I imagine none of you are looking to develop any like large scale projects. But without engagement, it creates the likelihood of opposition. So the example that I always go to is the Dakota Access Pipeline. That situation could have been handled ahead of time had they went out to the community and asked them what they needed to avoid, at least let them know that it was coming through. They just really lacked on that part, and it was actually a little bit funny because by the time they were building down there, the people on my reservation didn't know that it actually had passed through our reservation already. But for us, it was a good thing since we have a lot of hydrocarbon development, and it definitely saved a lot of lives moving oil and gas by pipeline. But not saying pipelines are good, but they definitely save lives. So so community engagement. So it should be done early and often. So as soon as you want to move ahead on a project, you need to start engaging with the community. Not just Indigenous communities, of course, any community that you're building a project in. And it should be from little tiny kids, elementary school, middle school, high school. They definitely need to learn and be involved and understand what's going on, and then all adults that are willing to pay attention. And then I have this last slide in here on energy equity. So traditionally, the energy industry has kind of caused more pollution in marginalized communities, poor, Black, brown communities. And this is a quote from Shalonda Baker, and it's, "If those best positioned and with the most resources to influence energy equity, or to influence equity into the debates on climate and energy fail, to do so, inequity will be baked into the policies meant to transition our society away from fossil fuels." So, this is really important. I definitely, like, we all know that there is a climate crisis right now. Like, we definitely need to move on climate change, but this is likely the only opportunity to have it be done in an equitable way, to include communities that traditionally haven't benefited from the development of energy, to give smaller communities more control over how their energy is produced, where it's coming from. Yeah, and that's about it. Are there any more questions?
You literally in energy terms and energy producing techniques and this looks like engineering.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you get started? How would somebody get started on building a geothermal plant? Is it a plant?
Yes. So there's
So what's the process? You just
yeah.
make a fire underneath and heat the water.
Yeah, so geothermal is so broad. So if you're looking to do it as an individual, you can put heat pumps on your house. But if you're looking to do something very large scale, then you have to hire a team of scientists to do a resource study.
How does it work?
Lunas, do you?
So it depends on how you want to do the thing. If you want to, let's say, repurpose the oil and gas wells, so the same as like, imagine like how you're doing the oil and gas well and transporting that, right? So you have your plant somewhere as like a source, and then according to those figures that Jessica provided, those water would be heated, so it become like a gas. So that would be transported as like a energy, and it would be transferred by like the wire line as electricity. So it really depends on how do you want to use that and where do you build that, because if it is shallow, if it is like a lower temperature, the structure might be a little bit different. When it becomes like down the earth or like a gathering fire that
So you dig a big hole where you heat water.
exactly like the well.
So you dig a well and you heat water in that well or
You don't actually need to heat the water because the water in that specific area is hot enough.
Okay, so you cannot build this anywhere. You have to go to the zones that are geothermal.
And it depends again, it depends on how do you want to use that. If you want to generate electricity, since you need the higher temperature, yes, you need to go deep enough. And again, even you don't go deep enough, if you use some of those fluid carrier or heat carrier that actually can heat enough heat with themselves, you really don't need the high temperature because they actually can carry the heat and bring it to the surface. But yes, if you want to use the cheaper method, let's say you want to use the brine, you need to go deep enough and then get it for the electricity generation.
Yes.
I'm not in the energy sector, but I looked at like examples of geothermal projects, and one thing that I've heard a couple times happening is people who try to use their geothermal system to store energy. Sometimes they build it in just the wrong place where it's part of like a basin where there would be groundwater that rushes kind of over the geothermal system and can pull that stored energy away. Is that a consideration?
That is definitely a consideration. A study would be done ahead of time to mitigate that. Yes?
Two questions. One, geothermal brine is a totally new phrase for me, so I was looking it up as you were going along. So thank you for providing that. And the articles that immediately popped up were two, one was even 3 years old. Is there anything current, this year or in the last year that says we're really succeeding on extracting lithium or other minerals from geothermal brine?
Yeah, so the Salton Sea is making a ton of advances. There's a CNN video that you could probably find on YouTube that came out maybe in April, where they talk about lithium extraction, specifically on the Salton Sea.
And the second question, in one of the slides, it appeared that Minnesota is a wasteland, not good.
Yes, so it's igneous rocks, which, yeah, it's just not,
I mean, it was all
Yeah.
white and
yeah,
there were lots
where
of
do we
good
have it?
colors surrounding it, even in Illinois.
Oh, no, signal. Yeah, so the eastern side of the United States isn't as hot as the western side. You have mountain building and basin and range features on the western side of the U.S., whereas the mountain building on the east side is like so tremendously old. It was part of a different supercontinent, so it's cooled down significantly over there. Yeah.
If you put it back in presentation mode, then it shows up on the screen again.
Oh yeah, okay. I wasn't sure what. Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Go back to it.
Jessica, can I add
That's
one?
fine.
Oh
Yeah.
yes.
Can I add one more thing? So the technology is not there. It doesn't mean that Minnesota is not potential.
Yes.
Because those teeny tiny dots that you see over there actually can generate so much electricity.
And this is also just for electricity. There are other applications with geothermal that can be developed
Sure,
in Minnesota.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, but the main issue is that since it's kind of a new introduced energy, renewable energy to the people, so the technology is not quite there. But now in New York, you see that New York is not in a good position in generation of the electricity, but now they have like an ongoing project over
Yes.
there, and they're pretty successful over there. So it's just about that they're trying all these new technology to see that if they can actually extract the amount of the energy that they're required for electricity generation.
So one thing that's really interesting about the geothermal industry is 2020, at the beginning of COVID, there was a huge downturn in oil and gas. I was former oil and gas industry. I worked for my tribe's oil and gas company. And my son happened to be born the day that oil was negative following COVID. Yeah. So that event created a huge shift in the industry, and it brought in a bunch of talent, like new talent, to think of new ways to develop it. And there's definitely been an explosion of development. Just
Can you just describe for everyone here the project that you, well, maybe there's more than one project, the projects that the MHA Nation is exploring, and maybe a little description of the most promising ones, or?
Yeah, so we're looking at developing electricity generating geothermal out of the Williston Basin. And in addition to that, so it's called combined heat and power. So we would be generating electricity and then having a district energy loop running through a small town on the reservation. And hopefully, in addition to being able to sell electricity, the goal is to have excess load for in additional industry. Not quite sure what that would be right now, but that's the goal. And this came out of a project that I did with Munis and other students from the University of North Dakota, and we won first place in a collegiate challenge for the DOE.
Yeah, so this isn't electricity production, but just another use of geothermal. I just bringing up something that's less than a mile from me, which is Carleton College switching over to entirely clean energy. And so I was I went to an in-service, or I went to a presentation by the sustainability manager, Martha Larson, who's a big person, but anyway, so she explained it, had a presentation, and then we went outside to where the drillers were. And so I got to chat with somebody. They were drilling 500-foot wells, and of course this was for heat.
Yep.
And it's connected with a system throughout the college where the heat from the cooking and the heat from the computers, is spread to places where it's needed. But these guys drilling 500-foot wells, and I say he was an old guy. I mean, I'm an old person too. But anyway, so the old guy we were talking to, one of the foremen, just looked like he'd been out in the open a lot, and I don't know if he had 10 fingers, I'm not sure. But anyway, so this good guy, and I didn't ask him, but I figured you guys have been drilling for something else before this, right? I mean, it's like the oil system, there's other things you can drill for, and I think this is like you said, it's an energy, it's an employment opportunity as the oil industry shuts down.
Yes.
That was just a really nice experience, and I also heard it when they turned off the steam engines, and I turned off the steam and entirely shut down the steam.
That's exciting.
So, just my anecdote.
Thank you. Yes.
First of all, thanks, it was great, and I learned a lot, so I really appreciate that. I think your title has something to do with engaging the community.
Yes.
And I just noticed that our questions here are pretty technical. I'm wondering if the conversations with the community are as geeky as this one is, or what are the conversations like when you engage the community?
Surprisingly, so I primarily work with indigenous communities, and they aren't super technical. It's kind of sometimes a lot of people have like their mind kind of made up on which way they kind of want to go, like before they come in the room. And then it's just kind of trying to dispel like misinformation, if they have it, but not super technical.
If there are objections, then what are the objections?
Pollution. There are some communities that view taking water out of an aquifer and bringing it up. They say that you polluted the water, even if it's not a water or not an aquifer, like if it's a brine aquifer. If it's not something that they would have utilized, it's still like, they still say it's polluted. Even if it doesn't come in contact with the air and goes back into the same formation, it's just opposed by some people.
But if you could take the lithium out, for example,
Yeah.
or cadmium or whatever
Yeah.
minerals you have in there, would that sort of appease that concern a little bit?
No.
So if I remember right, COVID money, Governor Burgum also spent COVID money on retiring or orphan wells. Isn't that right? Plugging
Yes.
orphan wells. He hired
Yep.
idle oil workers. What does that cost to?
I have no idea.
I mean, it just seems, because isn't some of your work dealing or repurposing orphan wells?
Yeah, we had a, I don't remember what it was. It's been a while since we looked at the economics on that. But yeah, but I did also want to add, induced seismicity is another big concern for community members.
What is?
Where you're potentially going to cause an earthquake by bringing up water or putting water back in. So reservoir management is extremely important.
And are there any other environmental
Yeah, definitely. There's always a potential for a spill. Like that's always a risk with anything. So it would be like hot water, if it's hot salty water potentially, that could cause an ecological disaster. But obviously it would be closely monitored to try to not let that happen. Munis?
So, since I know that the topic was about the community.
You could stand up and talk against, to us, it would help me over here, it's hard to hear.
So, I know that the topic was about the community engagement.
Yes.
So, can you tell us like a couple of ways that we can actually engage the community? And how we can evaluate those ways actually to make sure that it's engaged the people or not?
Yeah, so that's actually one thing that I've really been trying to consider is how you measure the success of engagement. And I'm definitely still working on that. I feel like if it seems like the population has a general like awareness and can get to the point where they can ask questions, I feel like that's a good indicator that you engage them, because oftentimes if someone doesn't have a question, then you might not have done a good job explaining enough for them to get to the point of understanding.
You used the phrase economic development, and if I've heard the previous answer, the concerns are pollution and causing earthquakes or that kind of thing.
Yep.
Is there any concern about whose money it is behind the economic development? Whether it's some outsiders coming in to the indigenous community?
Yeah, specifically with indigenous communities, we often partner with people on projects. So if it's being developed on indigenous land, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the setup of reservations, but there's land that's called fee land where the tribe's not involved at all because there was an allotment act where all natives got a certain amount of land, and then the government was like, okay, well you guys got that land, you don't need this land, so we're gonna sell it to settlers. So there's a lot of land on the reservation that's not owned by indigenous people at all. So that's called fee land. On that land, it would be the person that owns it can have whoever they want to develop it. A company can come in, they don't have to do much with the tribe. They might have to get like an environmental assessment, but that's it. But if it's on like native owned land, then the tribe would have more of a stake in that, and yeah, so then it would, someone just couldn't come in and develop it without the tribe working with them or authorizing permits.
Have you seen a push or heard of a push to sort of get geothermal in schools? In Minnesota, we have a couple of school districts that's already implemented and put geothermal facilities in their schools. But just the areas that you work at, I didn't know if there's been studies or actually that push to move more towards that.
Could you repeat the question for the people?
So he was asking if there is more geothermal development in schools. So yes, heat pumps. I feel like even like off the reservation, I feel like most new builds are utilizing heat pumps to offset their electricity use. So it's extremely widespread using heat pumps in schools and large office buildings.
Have you seen a difference in maybe higher education through K through 12, or is it pretty similar?
I think pretty similar. I think the biggest thing is if it's a new construction, it's easier than going back and retrofitting. There are grants that are more geared, I think, towards higher education for retrofitting. But definitely like new builds. Going
There was a
geothermal.
question over there. You
I was, getting back to some of the community concerns about geothermal. Is is a concern might be that if you're extracting energy from the aquifer, then you're changing the temperature of that aquifer. Is that a concern? Is it legitimate?
Yes, yep, that's a legitimate concern. So there's ways to measure the communication between the production well and the injection well, and it's expected for reservoirs to cool over time, but the amount of time is variable. And it depends on the depth and how much fluid you're pumping and extracting.
So if your aquifer gets cooler, what's the risk to people?
There isn't like really a risk to people, like if the aquifer cools down. Yes.
I'm curious about collaborating with the oil companies. They must be dealing with the brine issues, the aquifer issues, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Is anybody talking to them about geothermal? Is there a dialogue going on?
Yeah. So there have been some efforts. Our professor, Dr. Gosnell, he had a grant where he was putting an electricity generating system, so it was relatively small. It can go on oil and gas pad, probably like the size of like a railroad car, like smaller. And that they could have used the production water to electrify the rig, since they run a lot of pumps. That one didn't particularly work out because there was just some damage to the equipment when it arrived. But there's a company called Transitional Energy, and they're actively working on putting these systems on oil pads to use the waste heat and extract heat from brine.
This is a public company?
I'm not quite sure how they are structured. Do you know? Transitional Energy? No?
But the other companies like Chevron.
Yes, the big oil and gas companies are really looking into, like Chevron, Baker Hughes, into developing like the deeper geothermal. I was just specifically addressing the waste or the production water. But yeah, oil companies are investing in geothermal.
Interesting.
Oh, yes?
When it comes to the community engagement part, who or how is it, the engagers, those who are gonna lead that process and do it successfully, who might those people do? Are they local, are they the elected officials, or are they other kinds of community leaders, or are they the people who have a vision for economic development and want to present that to the community? Who are the people best able to conduct that community engagement?
Yeah, so it is a combination of people. So when you reach out to a community, you often start with leadership and finding champions within the community that are interested and willing to volunteer. I think some companies actually pay locals to help get the message out into the community. But yeah, so local champions and community leaders, and of course the company that's also involved in the project. Oh, yes?
I get the feeling that, in particular with energy generation, it's something that's an old idea that is really going its infancy in terms of commercializing a lot. Like there aren't a lot of installed geothermal electric generation, is that true?
The United States actually has the largest capacity for installed geothermal, but it is mostly California, Nevada, yeah, along.
I wonder if we would expect to see, over the next 10 years or sometime like a lot more that would require community engagement to
Yes.
help those projects.
Yeah, Yes?
One other question. So part of our agenda for CCL is permitting reform.
Yes.
And we're actually going to have another speaker talking about that tomorrow morning. But I heard you say permitting reform is one of those barriers. Are there thoughts you have on what we might ask for? And another part of that is one of the principles that we're looking for when we advocate for permitting reform is early community engagement. And I don't know if you have thoughts both around are the permitting issues different for geothermal versus other clean energy, and how does community engagement fit into that reform for you?
So I don't know too much about other clean energy.
Okay.
I mean, a little bit, but Munis, I'm sure you have some thoughts here.
About the permitting reform?
Yeah.
So yes, that from the project that Verizon was part of, we learned that at least in North Dakota, we do not have any specific rule. I mean, that if you want to do the project, they're gonna ask you if you're not permitted to do that because there is no specific rule permitting for doing the geothermal project. Or on the other hand, if you just ask any of like the oil and gas companies to start and helping us to do the project, they're gonna tell you that you're not permitted to do that.
Yes.
So that was one of the issues that we were facing in North Dakota.
There's also an issue of resource ownership. There's some states that say that the surface owner is the person that owns the heat resource. And I've heard like some that say it's the mineral owner because sometimes they're separated, the surface and minerals.
And the same for the abandoned oil and gas wells, because we have lots of abandoned oil and gas wells, and one of our, the senator of North Dakota actually spent a lot of money to repurpose those oil and gas wells, but still they're just believing that if we don't know anything about geothermal and you are not allowed to repurpose and use your wells for the geothermal purposes. So since there isn't any specific permitting reform in that regard, so for that reason, people cannot do a project and use those wells for the geothermal purposes.
Any other questions? Yes?
You said there was like a high initial risk, but then it kind of goes down as the project is underway.
Yes. So, was there more to it?
Just like why would the risk go down?
So, there's decision points. So, each phase is a yes/no point. So, after you finish, like, say, the pre-feasibility study,
You're talking about financial risk?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's financial risk and just project risk too. So if your resource isn't there, then you just like say no, and then that's the end of the project in that location. So each of these markers is a yes/no point. If it's yes, then you move on to the next phase, and by the time you reach operations, then you de-risked.
And something else to that. So, for example, in your pre-feasibility stage, right, you're doing your resource assessment. Understand that if that place is suitable for the geothermal research or not. And Jessica mentioned that one of the concerns of the people is about the seismic inducity. And for example, in North Dakota, we do not have any active fault that the earthquake happened. So technically, when you're in that specific phase, you realize that you do not have any issue with the seismic inducity, so we can move on to the next stage. Yes. Regarding in that specific parameter, but for each of those parameters, you can actually in each of those phases, you can realize that okay, I can move to the next step or not.
Does that mean that like cost-wise, once you have the project approved, you should expect the cost to?
Yeah, because then you're drilling wells, you're building facilities. So, so as the project is approved to move forward, then just your development costs are going to go up to.
Or they go up initially, and then how does the maintenance of geothermal plants? How's the cost of that?
Yeah, I don't know.
So the huge cost is the upfront cost.
Right.
And for that specific reason, they just want to repurpose the oil and gas wells. Because if you use that, actually, even the upfront cost would be decreased, and it would be a very feasible project. And even now in California, majority of the project is happening and going on over there because they are using they repurpose their oil and gas wells for the geothermal purposes.
Yeah.
So when you're done with that, the maintenance wouldn't be a huge thing.
They're relatively low.
Low,
maintenance.
exactly, yeah.
Yes.
I guess related to maintenance, is there ever, if you're using the brine, is there ever an issue of, like scaling, like building
Yes.
up on the insides of the pipes?
Munis is starting a company for descaling pipes. Geothermal pipes.
She's actually a co-founder.
Like you
yes.
seriously are.
So, yes, there is. And for that specific reason, as she mentioned earlier, the geochemistry of the water and the reservoir is very important for us. So when you're in each of those phases, the treatment of the water happens to actually, you can avoid doing that. So I'm going to give you a very simple example. Recently, we visited a plant in Reno, Nevada, and the people who were actually on the land and doing the project, they didn't even know that the scaling issue exists because it's somehow handled. And when we went to the operation room, the people said that this is a huge problem, but we are using a lots of chemical actually to retrieve that pipeline and make sure that the fluid can go. But if there are like a specific scaling device, descaling device that can work over there with a lower cost, that would be better for us because it's physical, so it's not any kind of environmental issue. So what I'm trying to say is that they usually do that, but it's not like a huge problem because the industry can handle that problem using either physical or chemical treatments. Yes.
I'm interested to hear this. Curious, how does one compare the cost sort of per kilowatt hour or something? We have different renewable energies we use: wind, solar, geothermal, tidal. There's lots more harebrained things out there.
Yeah.
But how does this compare?
Geothermal is more expensive per kilowatt at the moment than other renewables.
Do you know any numbers, kind of like?
Yeah. So I think one project that I was looking at recently, we were looking at, I think, between 10 and 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So definitely more expensive. But one of the hopes is more grants coming from the government. They have not put as much towards geothermal as they have towards wind and solar and hydrogen. They've surprisingly thrown a lot at hydrogen. And yeah, and as technology improves, prices will go down. And one thing too with it is, you kind of have to look at paying more for less of an impact on the environment.
And also it's a base load, right?
Yes, and it's a baseload energy resource.
And those costs, that's over the lifetime of the project. I mean, what is, so you put in a geothermal plant, how long do you expect that to be operational for?
You know, like 40, 50 years.
And those costs would be higher for the entire 40 or 50 years?
No, they would at some point start to go down.
Is it one of those things where there's that high upfront cost, but then the longer it's in
Yes.
operation, the ongoing